So the recording has started. Now, before we get started with today's class, welcome back to IT. You're working on your final topic for IT, which is programming. And I would have noticed some of you, this is not targeting anybody. This is just, I'm mentioning something in general so that you can have an understanding as to the situation. Now, some persons already started creating their program. Nothing is wrong with that. Nothing is wrong with you going ahead with that. But I would have mentioned that there are certain things you need to do before you actually create the program. If you notice right now, I have the mark scheme on the screen. And I would have mentioned this already, that just getting the program working, as you can see here, it's only how much mark? 1 mark. Computer is moving a bit slow. Yeah, it's just 1 mark. 1 mark to get that program up and working. What's wrong with my computer? So, what does that mean? I would have mentioned that there are a few things you need to do before you actually create your program. And if you go ahead and create the program, then that means you would have to create the other tasks to match your program, which you should have been creating these first tasks, and then you create your program so that you don't end up with double work. Because it could end up with a situation that maybe you're finished with your program working, but then the other tasks, which are creating your pseudocode, creating your trace table, and that's about it. Creating your pseudocode and your trace table, it doesn't match your program. So now you gotta go and change your program. That's why we're taking things in steps. That's why I haven't shown you guys up to now how to create a program, because there's certain things you have to do before. If you notice, the entire program SB is 15 marks, worth 15 marks. Creating the pseudocode is a total of 6 marks. And that's what we're currently looking at. How to create a pseudocode. Then when we're finished creating that pseudocode, you have to create a trace table. That is worth 4 marks. And once again, the program is only worth 1 mark. So the focus of this entire program in SB is not mainly on creating that program. It's all the other tasks that come before it. Once again, I'm mentioning that. Creating your pseudocode, creating your trace table, creating your problem statement, and ensuring that the pseudocode, everything is okay with it. Well, actually, to correct myself, the program is not only 1 mark. I forgot this part here. The program is actually 4 marks, not 1 mark. But that's only 4 marks out of the total of 15. So the 11 other marks, you have to ensure it matches up with that program that you're creating. So It's just a reminder I'm giving you again. Don't stress too much behind the program as yet, because we don't want to have to do double work. Let's focus on taking things in steps. I've already asked you to create your IPO charts and send that to me, your problem statement, and send that to me. Up to now, nobody has done that. So let me see, where's the file we were working on last week? Are you guys clear on what I said so far? For those who would have just joined, in summary of what I would have said so far, you have your programming tasks that you have to complete. Your programming SBA is worth 15 marks. Creating your pseudocode is worth 6 marks out of that 15. Creating your trace table is worth 4 marks. Creating the program is worth 4 marks also. And your problem statement is 1 mark, and other forms of documentation. So some of you would have already finished majority of your other SBAs, other parts of the IT SBA. Please start working on your final parts of your SBA. You already have the structure of your problem statement. I would have already told you to start that. Send it to WhatsApp so that I can confirm that you're heading in the right direction. I would have also given you the task to start your IPO charts. And you're supposed to send that also so that we can confirm that is okay. And you can basically also start your pseudocode for your program that you have to create, because I would have already showed you some of the major tasks that you have to carry out. Well, basically, you should only create the pseudocode to confirm the IPO charts. So all this information, you have it already. To continue with where we left off, we're at the final parts of pseudocode. I would have shown you guys already what is the layout of a pseudocode: the title, declaration, initialization, the body, the end. I showed you guys what is sequential statements, how to add conditional statements, how to use the if then and if then else statements. And then we would have ended off with nesting those statements, basically putting one inside of the other. So today we are going to start with loops, and that should be the final part of pseudocode. yeah, that should be the final part of pseudocode for you to be able to fully create your pseudocode for your program. So let's begin. Loops. So we know that a loop, the normal general term for the word loop, is basically something that goes around. So basically a circle. It starts at one point and it reaches back. Wherever it goes, basically, is going to reach back at that point, wherever it would have started as a loop. Similarly, a program uses loop statements. And the same principle, when you want a group of statements to repeat itself over and over, you put them inside of a loop. So maybe you want the phrase, have a nice day, to be repeated on the screen maybe 10 times. Then you can simply put that into a loop to say that this phrase here should appear 10 times on the screen. That's the purpose of loops, so that you don't have to write back that step 10 times. So what I mean by that, if you were to loops pseudocode. You guys hear me clearly?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
What is output again? Oh, so step 1, output, have a nice day. So I'm just showing you an example as to how it would appear in a program. So this here is the normal method of if you want something to be done repeatedly. You could actually write it into different steps. Maybe you want the phrase have a nice day to appear 5 times on the screen. Then you could say step 1, output have a nice day. Step 2, output have a nice day. Step 3, output have a nice day. So you keep outputting that phrase. Now, this is inefficient because we don't want to write the same thing multiple times. We don't want too much lines of codes in the program. If it's possible, we want as few as we can. So it could be that, or the more efficient method is going to be step 1, repeat. This is one of the keywords that we can use for loops. We can say repeat, repeat, output, have a nice day, until count is greater than 5. And here you can say something like count equal count plus 1. So this here is basically a summarization of this here. Now, it might look like if it's 4 lines and this is 5 here, but just imagine if this was like 10 or 20 lines. This 4 line would have remained the same. What is basically happening here is that we're basically saying to repeat whatever is inside of this section here. And let me not confuse you with this last part here. Let me not confuse you as yet. So let me just put end here to indicate that. So we can basically say repeat and say what we want to repeat. And we would have a mechanism to basically say how many times we should repeat it for. That's what I basically had there just now. Repeat until maybe a variable called count is greater than 5. So that's how we would know how many times it should repeat for. So it's basically reducing the number of lines that we have in the program. So that's the principle of loops. So basically wrap something around, wrap the loop statements around the whatever statements we want to repeat. As we go through the examples, you should be able to follow along better. So the statements of loops are arranged to depend on the results of a variable. Now most loops cycle through the statements as follows. Basically, all loops have these 4 steps here. Basically, all loops have these 4 steps, or these 4 actions they carry out. 1, input a starting value to a specific variable. This variable usually determines whether or not the loop executes or not. So in a nutshell, a loop uses a variable. That variable is going to be used to monitor the loop, to know whether you should stay in the loop or you should exit the loop. That's basically what you saw me doing here. I was basically using a variable called count to know whether I should stay in the loop or I should exit the loop. So we're going to understand how we use that later on, but it's just for you to note that all loops use a variable to monitor whether you're going to stay in that loop or you are going to exit that loop. We'll come back to this later on when we look at an example. 2, we must test that variable. So this relates to number 1. The variable has to be tested every time the loop repeats itself. That's how we know whether to exit or enter the loop or stay in the loop. It has to be tested all the time. Every time we go around that loop, it has to be tested over and over. 3, inside of the loop is going to have a body. So every time we go through the loop, that body gets executed. And then 4, we have to update that variable to know that basically we would have been going through this loop over and over. So that's why you would have seen me typed in earlier count equal count plus 1. This here is the method of updating a loop. Updating the variable. We basically add 1 to the variable every time the loop is carried out. Every time we go through the loop, a 1 is added to that variable. It's like if you're counting. So when you start the loop, it's going to be something like this here. The variable count is going to be equal to 0. Count is going to start off with 0. So as you go through the loop the first time, it's going to add 0 to 1. And remember how we learned whatever's on the right hand gets stored on the left. So now count has a value of 1. And that's why we say repeat until count is greater than 5. So when we reach at the bottom here, it checks to see if count is greater than 5. Count has a value of 1. So it's not greater than 5. So we go through the loop. We go back to the top. We output have a nice day. And then we reach back at this step here. So this here should have actually been step 2, step 3, step 4, so that we can actually count it. Now, the second time we go through the loop, it's going to basically be 1 plus 1, because count had a value of 1 before. So this is why in the previous classes, when I was going through pseudocode, I told you that's called tracing the pseudocode. And every time I was going through the pseudocode, I was writing down my values. When we said this year, I was writing down 2023. When we said birth year, I wrote down 2000. When we reached the calculation, I wrote down the values even here to do my calculation. Because it helps you to remember the values as you go through the pseudocode. So, in this case here, this is the second time we're going to go through this loop here. So that's why we have to remember that the value inside of count was 1 before. So now it's going to be 1 plus 1. And then that now is going to be 2, obviously. 1 plus 1 is 2. And that gets stored into the variable count on the left hand. And then we reach step 4. Repeat until count is greater than 5. Is 2, because now it has 2 inside of it. We now ask ourselves, is 2 greater than 5? No, so we basically repeat again. This here should have been outside because it's not going to use back that. So we start back at step 1, repeat, output have a nice day, and then we remember from before that count is actually 2, so we replace that with 2. 2 plus 1, that is going to give us 3, and it repeats like that over and over until it reaches the point, and this is the test. This is the test that you're seeing at the bottom here. This is the test. So this is where we are testing to see if we should stay in the loop or not. So that's this aspect here. The 4 things I was mentioning. We have a variable that we're going to use to monitor the loop. That's this count variable here. So variable to monitor the loop. The count variable. Then we have to test that variable. We have to keep testing that variable to know whether we are going to stay in that loop or not. So this step number 4 is an example of that test. We're testing to see if this count variable is greater than 5. Anytime it's greater than 5, come out of the loop. Basically, repeat until it is greater than 5, and then we come out of the loop. So this is an example of a test. It's basically the same as you would have been learning about criterias and so on. You're basically asking a question. Is it greater than 5? If it is, you come out of the loop. You're running a test. Number 3, the body. The body is basically what is inside of the loop so that you know what is basically going to be carried out. This here is the body. That's what it's going to be repeating over and over. And then lastly, the updates. This here is an example of an update. An update is simply adding 1 to the variable so that you know that you would have went through that loop, how many times you would have went through it basically. So the first time you went through it, that's why the variable starts off with 0. That's why it starts off with 0 at the top here. So that when the first time it goes through the loop, it's basically going to be 0 plus 1. And that's how we're going to know it ran for 1 time, because 0 plus 1 is 1, and 1 is going to be stored into counts. So when it reaches the test, it's going to be checking, is count greater than 5, or basically is 1 greater than 5. And then it will know that it should not exit the loop and basically go back from the top. So if you're not clear on that, it's just for you to understand the 4 parts of any loop. All loops have these 4 parts, these 4 components. It has a variable that is going to be used to monitor the loop. It has a test to see whether you should stay in that loop or not. It's going to have a body, basically what is going to be repeated, and then you must update that variable to know whether you should stay in that loop or not. Are you guys following? Any questions?
Not right now, sir.
All right. All right, let's move on. Now, the next key piece of information is that there are 2 types of loops that you need to remember. We have what are called indefinite loops and definite loops. So indefinite meaning something that goes on and we do not know the actual amount. So it goes on indefinitely. So almost like we're saying it's infinite. So when we do not know in advance how many times we should repeat the loop, we use indefinite loops. So the examples of indefinite loops are the while loop and the repeat loop. So when we do not know if we should repeat this loop 10 times, 20 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, when you do not know how many times to run a loop for, you use the indefinite loop. Examples of the indefinite loops are the while loop and the repeat loop. Now, when you know in advance how many times you should run the loop for, you use a definite loop. And the example of the definite loop is the for loop. So basically, if you know you want to run the loop for 10 times, you use the for loop. If you know you want it to run for 20 times, guaranteed 20 times, you use the for loop. So once again, if you do not know how many times to repeat something, to loop something, you use the while or the repeat loop. When you do know that you want to run it for 25, whatever number of times, you know how much you want it to run for, you use the for loop. Straightforward. Now, we're going to first look at the indefinite loops. And this is the structure of the 2 indefinite loops, the while loop and the repeat loop. You have to remember the structure. It comes in your exam every year, or it will be part of your exam. Might not come, but over 50% chance that it will be in your exam, because CXC questions you a lot on programming. And this is the one thing that they do question you on. The format or the structure of the loops. So all loops, once again, they have a start value. They have a variable, as we would have mentioned. They have a variable that is going to have a start value. So no matter the loop, whether it's a while loop, whether it's a repeat loop, it's going to have a variable that's starting off with a value. For example, count equal 0. It may start off with that value of 0. Now, where you see perform statements, that is the body. So what does this mean? And where you see condition is true, that is your test. Condition is true, that is your test. So what this means is that for the while loop, the test comes before the body. And in the repeat loop, the test comes after the body. That's very important to remember. Because even though they are both indefinite loops, they function differently. They are for different purposes because of where they have the body and where they have the test. They still carry out different function. So please remember that the while loop, the test comes before the body, and the repeat loop, the test comes after the body. So we are going to look at the while loop first. So the while loop repeatedly executes one or more statements as long as the condition is true. So that's another difference. There's basically 4 differences that you need to remember between the while loop and the repeat loop. There are 4 differences that you need to remember. The position of the test in the body are 2 of those differences. Now, the other difference is when to exit and when to enter the loop. So, as it mentions here, the while loop repeatedly executes one or more statements as long as the condition is true. What is meant by that? The test has to be true in order for you to stay in the loop, or in order for you to carry out the loop. So the while loop, the test has to be true in order for you to stay in that loop, or in order for you to run that loop. Obviously, you got to enter it first, and then you can stay in it. So the test has to be true first in order for you to enter. And in order for you to repeat the loop, the test has to continue to be true. The condition in a while loop is tested at the beginning, as we mentioned here. The test is at the beginning, is before the body of the loop, so it is possible for the statement to not be executed at all. So that's the final difference there. The final difference is basically what is the possibility of the loop running. The possibility of the while loop running is that it could theoretically never run at all, because the test is at the beginning. So to summarize it, because I know it gets complicated. While loop, repeat loop, so the while loop has a test at the beginning. The repeat loop has the test at the end. Body at the end. So that means the body is at the end for the while loop, and body at the beginning for the repeat loop. So it's basically, if you can remember one, you just have to reverse it, and it will be for the other. The test at the end for this one, test at the beginning for the while, body at the beginning, body at the end. Now, the other difference, test has to be true to enter / stay in the loop. And it's basically going to be the opposites for the repeat loop. The test has to be true to exit the loop. The while loop has the possibility of never running, has the possibility of running only once. So that's the four differences there. The four differences that you must remember for the loops. The while loop has a test. The repeat loop has a test. What's the location? The while loop has it at the beginning. The repeat loop has it at the end. All loops have a body. In the while loop, the body is at the end of the loop, or basically after the test. The repeat loop, the body is at the beginning, or basically before the test. Now, point number 3, the third difference. What you need to remember here is that when you run a test, and I think I would have mentioned this already in Excel and database and so on. Whenever we run a test, we are looking at some sort of criteria. It's always mainly checking to see if it is true. That's the first thing it checks for, if it is true. And if it is not, then it considers false. So that's what's happening here. It's checking to see if the condition is true, and then what to do. If not, which then is going to be false, what to do then. So, for the while loop, what to do if the condition is true? You either enter or stay in the loop. Now the repeat loop, whenever the condition is true, it is basically to exit that loop. Now, the final point, the final difference, is the possibility of the program running. What's the possibility? What's the probability of it running? The while loop has the possibility of never running. Why is that the case? Well, let me see if I can find paint. The loops are something you have to imagine. Imagine it like a gate. basically. So this is the while loop. Imagine it like like a gate, and there's a garden. This is the repeat loop. So we're going this way, right? We're going downward. Now, the while loop has a test at the beginning. So what we're going to do, we're going to put a gate here. So a door, or we can say a door. We put in a door here. The door is locked. So the repeat loop, where is that test? Where is that door? It's at the very end. So it's at the end of the program. The door is at the end of the program, or the gate. So we can see that difference there already. So this door, this gate, this is the test. Now, the body. Obviously, the body is whatever is inside. So when you get into the gate, or before this gate here, this white empty space, that's the body. So where's my cursor? Body. So this is all the statements that you want to repeat, or you want to loop for that program. 3. The test has to be true to enter or stay in the loop. That's for the while loop. Basically, say, remember we're going downwards. We're going downwards. So we started at the top. For the while loop, the test has to be true in order for you to enter. So basically, if you never get the answer true, you will never enter into this loop. So that's how we end up with this third bullet point here, this third difference. The test has to be true for you to enter or stay into that loop, in that loop. So if you, whenever you reach this gate, whenever you reach the step number to run this test, if the test is never true, you will never get into the loop. If it is true, you do get into the loop. Remember, you got to run the test again. So if it is true, only then would you stay inside here. If it is false, and put false at the bottom here. If it's false, then you are going to exit that loop. That's not eraser. That's not eraser also. Wait, that is eraser. Why is it erasing like that? Anyway, try to erase like that. And put the false outside there. Alright. Yeah. So if it's false, you exit. Now, the repeat loop, it's true to exit. So, if you want to come out, it has to be true. And if you want to be inside, it has to be false. So anytime, alright, let me not get ahead of ourselves there. I forgot to mention point number 3 for the repeat loop. Alright, so let me go back. So the while loop, the test has to be true in order for you to enter. So while loop on the left hand, the gate, the test is at the very beginning. So it controls entry into the loop. It controls entry to the body. So unless it is true, only then would you execute the body. If it is false, then you basically carry on. You bypass the loop and you continue onward. Now the repeat loop, if you notice, so that is why the while loop has a possibility of never running. Point number 4. That's why it has a possibility of never running. Because the gate is at the very beginning. It's like if you constantly walk up to the gate and you get the answer wrong all the time, you get the test false all the time, you will never enter into the loop. So that is why the while loop has a possibility of never running. Are you guys clear on these 4 points to the while loop?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
The rest of you clear? The rest of you have any questions? Nathan, Jason?
Yes, sir, I understand.
All right. Now, the repeat loop. We understand that the test is at the end. So that's why I'm representing that the gate is at all the way at the end. The test is there. The body is at the beginning. So you basically go through the body and then you reach the gate or the test. So the test has to be true in order to exit. So that's why you have true outside here. In order for you to pass through this gate, in order for you to exit the loop, the test has to be true. If it is false, you're going to stay inside here. You're going to stay repeating the loop over and over every time if it is false. So that is why the repeat loop has the possibility of running only once. The repeat loop has the possibility of running only once. Why? Because remember, we're going top down. So as you run step 1, step 2, you reach the loop, you are going to carry out the body. Because there's nothing stopping you at the very beginning, like the while loop, to run the body. So you carry out the statements, the steps that the body has, and then you reach the gate. When you reach the gate now, it's for you to check to see whether you should actually repeat this loop or you should just continue your way. So if when you do reach the gate and you get through, then that means you only run the loop one time. So that's the 4 differences between the while loop and the repeat loop. And remember, they're both indefinite loops, but as I mentioned, they function differently. Why are they designed this way? There are certain cases where you only want the body to run unless there's a certain requirement. That's the purpose of the while loop. So maybe unless a certain price is met, maybe until the person enters 5,000, maybe until the person enters 10,000, then only then this loop should be carried out. So this criteria has to be met in order for this loop to be carried out. That's the while loop. The criteria has to be true first. But the repeat loop, you want it to at least run one time. That's the purpose of the repeat loop. There are certain cases where you want it to run at least one time. You don't care whatever is the result, whatever happens, you just want it to run one time. And then you're going to know whether to repeat the loop or not. That's the purpose of the repeat loop. So, are we clear on the differences between the 2 loops?
Yes, sir.
Any questions from anybody?
No, sir.
Stephanie, Amelino?
No, sir.
Okay.
All right. Well, is that simple? Or y'all that smart? I hope so. All right. So I just shared with you the 4 differences there. That's one of the hard parts. Now, notice you have a structure here. When you are adding your loop to your pseudocode, or even if you're in your exam, you're going to see this structure here in a pseudocode. It's going to start with the while keyword. Then it's going to have a condition. It's going to have a test. And remember, we learned that for the while loop, if the condition is true, then we enter the loop. So that's why they have here condition is true. We carry out the statements. Notice we have another keyword here called end while. We use that to indicate the end of the while loop. Like how we had end if. We had the if statement, and then we had end if. So we know that it started here, it ended there. Similarly, while indicates the beginning and while indicates the end, and notice the indentation also. Remember I told you guys that we indent to show that certain statements, certain steps belong to a certain keyword or a certain section. That's why we indent. So let's look at some examples now. Once again, the examples that we're going to look at, you can simply replicate it into your pseudocode that you have to create. It's just for you to understand the pattern, and with that same pattern now, you can create your own loops. So at the top here, we have a title, pseudocode 30, numbers in a loop. Step 1, notice we have our variable. So remember I said all loops have 4 components, 4 parts. It has a variable to monitor the loop. That is this, I put V there, that is this number equal 1. So number is the variable that is going to be monitoring the loop. Now here we're giving it a starting value of 1. In my example, I gave it a starting value of 0. They're giving it a starting value of 1. Step number 2. We have the keyword while, and here we have our test. They're not a part of the loop. So we're testing to see if the variable number is less than equal to 3. So it's basically saying, is 1 less than equal to 3? Now, you asked it in a question format, is 1 less than equal to 3? No. That means that is false. What do we do when, sorry, am I going correct? Nobody even know that I'm going wrong. The answer is yes. 1 is less than 3. Nobody can even tell me that 1 is less than 3. What do we do when a while loop is true?
So when it's true, the code is run, like you go ahead with whatever.
Or in simple terms, we execute the loop. So this here condition here is true. So that means we have to execute the loop. So we begin. This is going to be step number 3. Notice our update is here. So I told you guys this is the pattern as to how you update the variable. The same variable that you use to monitor, that you use to test, the same variable you have to update. The purpose of the update, once again, is to indicate to the system that you would have executed this loop. That's why it's always updating by 1. because the 1 is going to indicate that it's run for that particular amount of time. So if you keep adding 1, it's going to increase and thus indicate the total amount of time it was run. So in this case, it's going to be 1 plus 1. Now 1 plus 1 is 2, so that 2 now is going to be stored into the variable number. Now we go to step 4. Output, the number is, and then this is the variable. Now this here is an example of how you output a phrase and a variable. Please take note. This is an example as to how you output a phrase with a variable at the same time. The phrase goes into double quotation marks. The comma is indicating that is the end of that phrase. And then we put the name of the variable. So when this is output on the screen, it's going to basically show up as the number is, and whatever number is inside of this variable, that is going to appear as 2. This comma is not going to show up on the screen. This comma that you see in here is not going to show up on the screen because it is not inside of the quotation mark. This comma is only being used to separate the phrase from the variable so that the system can detect the difference. When you're doing your program, it's the same thing you'll have to do to separate your phrases and your variable using that same comma. So once again, this is the pattern of how you output a phrase with a variable. The reverse could have been done also. It could have been number, comma, quotation mark, whatever is inside, close quotation mark. And then you can even further continue comma and then another variable. So it's just to remember, this is how we output a phrase in a quotation mark. The variable does not go in quotation mark because quotation marks are used to indicate whatever is inside of this quotation mark, output that exactly. The system cannot recognize space. So this space that you see in here, if you had not put the quotation mark, it would have thought that these were different words, separate words. Yes, they are separate words, but we as humans, we group them together to make a sentence. Programming does not work with sentences. Individual words have meanings. That's how we get keywords and statements. So whenever we want to output a space, we have to put it into quotation marks. Otherwise, the system would not recognize that. Are we following so far?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right, good. Now remember, we're still working with the loop. So this here has 2. The number is 2. The variable has the number 2. Now, remember the condition was true. Here, condition was true. So that means we have to repeat the loop. So we gotta go back from the top. Now this is where I kept advising you to trace, to write down as you're tracing. So when we go back from the top here, remember this is the starting of the loop, this is the ending. We're not going all the way to the top here. So 1 is not going to reset back to 1. Sorry, number is not going to reset back to 1. It's going to keep this old value of 2. So when we go to the top here, it's going to be, is 2 less than equal to 3? That's the question that's going to be asked here. Is 2 less than equal to 3? Now, that's going to be yes, and once again true. So we go through the loop here again. Step number 3 is going to be 2 plus 1. 2 plus 1 is 3. That's going to be stored into number. And then we output the number is 3. Now once again the test was true. That means we have to repeat the loop. So we go back to the top. We keep that value of 3. We test to see, is 3 less than equal to 3? Equal sign. Yes, it is equal. So that means it's true. That means we begin the loop. So it's going to be 3 plus 1. 3 plus 1 is going to give us 4. And then we go to step number 4. Output, the number is, and we output 4. Now, remember the test was true, so we gotta go back to the top again. But when we go back to the top, now it's going to be 4. So, 4, the test is gonna ask us, is number less than equal to 3? Or basically, is 4 less than equal to 3? No, that means it is false. What do we do when a while loop is false? We exit the loop. We ignore everything in between and we go to step number 5, output out of the loop, and then we end the loop. And that is basically how the loop statements work. Now another reason why you have to trace it like that is because in the exam they could ask you, what is the value of the variable number in the third loop? Exactly like that they can ask you. What is the value of the variable number in the third loop? So when the loop was repeated for the third time, what value did that variable number have? Did it have 2? Did it have 3? Did it have 4? That they can ask you. So that's why you have to trace it carefully. Any questions from anybody?
No, sir.
All right. Let's take a few minutes break. I'm getting a migraine right now. I gotta take a tablet.
Okay, sir.
All right, let's continue. Are you guys there?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So let's look at the other examples of the while loop, and then we can wrap up there. I'll give you guys a homework on applying on using the while loop to see if you were clear on how to use it. So let's look at this example here. So we have a title, Pseudocode 14, younger than 20. Step number 1, we got a variable. So the variable, and is being given the starting value of 15, the variable age. Now step number 2, we have while. Now notice we don't have any end while. So this is where indentation comes into play. So this is going to be step number 3, step number 4, step number 5. And step number 5 is not a part of the loop. Why do we know that? Even though there's no end while, simply because of the indentation. There is no indentation of that step number 5. So step number 2, we're going to run the test. Is age less than 20? So we check to see, is age less than 20? Yes. That means true. So that means we run the loop because age, the test is true. So we go to step number 3 and we output you are a teenager. And then we update that variable because remember we always have to update it to show that we carried out the loop. So it's basically going to be 15 plus 1 is going to be 16. Now it's going to go through that over and over. It's going to go through 16, 17, 18, 19, and so on. So we're just going to fast forward. So say eventually we reach to age is 18. While age is less than 18, is 18 less than 20? Yes, true. We go through the loop. 18. Let's think about it. Let me work with 19 instead. Yeah, so 19. Is 19 less than 20? Yes. Then we output you are a teenager. Then it's going to be 19 plus 1. That's going to be 20 stored inside here. So when we loop back up to the top, the test is going to be 20 here. And then it's going to ask, is 20 less than 20? The answer is going to be no, false. And then what do we do when the while loop is false? We exit that loop. When we exit in this case, we go to step 5, which is to output you are not a teenager. Are we clear in this example?
Yes, sir.
Any questions from anybody? So remember, it's a pattern that you're following. That same 4-part component, having a variable, having a body, update, and a test. And that variable having a starting value. So it's just recreating that pattern. All right. Let's look at the final example. So we have a title here. We have 3 variables being initialized, total to 0, count to 0, average to 0. Now, step 1, we output enter a mark. So that's going to be output on the screen. Now this here also is an example of how you will be doing your output and input for your pseudocode. You should always do what is called a prompt. A prompt is a phrase, a sentence, an instruction that will appear on the screen, basically telling the person what to do. In this case, an output or a text will appear on the screen saying, enter a mark. So the person will know that the system is now waiting for them to enter that mark. So that's why this step 2 is right after input mark. Now step 3, while mark is not equal to -1, so we got to enter a mark. So we can say we enter 80. So while mark is not equal to -1, we basically asking now, is 80 not equal to -1? Is that true or false? Is 80 not equal?
True.
True.
True, sir.
That is correct. 80 is not equal to -1. So that means it's true. That means we enter the loop. So we carry out step number 4, which is take the variable total, which has a 0 inside of it, and then add it to the variable mark, which has 80 inside of it. And then we store it into total again. Step number 5, we have our update. Count plus 1. Count has 0 at the top here. So that's going to be 0 plus 1. So this 1 now is going to be stored into count. Are we following so far?
Yes, sir.
Step 6, we're going to output on the screen again, enter a mark, another prompt. Step 7, the person is going to enter the mark again. Now I'm going to enter 60. Now remember, everything is true so far, so we have to go back to the top. Now the mark we entered is 60, so now it's going to basically ask, is 60 not equal to -1? And once again, that is true. 60 is not equal to -1. So we enter the loop. Now we reach back to step number 4, and remember total has 80 inside of it. So it's going to be 80 plus mark, which has a 60 inside of it. So that's 80 plus 60. That's going to give us 140, which has to now be stored into total. Step number 5, count plus 1. Now count has a value of 1. So that's going to be 1 plus 1, which is going to give us 2 inside here. Then we enter a mark. Now in this case here,
Your screen is dark, sir.
yeah, computer slow down. You see it now?
Yes, sir.
Very good. So now we enter -1. So we enter a mark, step 6. Should have been down here. So we enter a mark, -1. Now we go back to the top, and it's going to be, is -1 not equal to -1? It is equal, so that means it's false. -1 is not equal to -1. So because the while loop condition is false now, that means we have to exit the loop. So we go straight to step number 8. Step number 8 now, we take the variable total, which has a 140 inside of it, and divide it by the variable count, which has a 2 inside of it. And that's going to give us 70 as our average. And step number 9, we display average, which is going to display 70 on the screen. Any questions on this one? Everybody clear on everything that happened in this loop? All right.
Yes, sir.
Sir,
Yes, sir.
sir, could you go with one more time?
Everything?
Not no. After the end while.
Oh, well, the end while is just some calculation being carried out. So remember, we on the right hand side is total divided by count. So the total currently, based on the loop situation, the current value of total has a 140 inside of it. And the current value of count has a 2 inside of it. So that's why it's 140 divided by 2, which is going to give us 70, and we store that into average.
Thanks, sir.
Alright, so I don't think we can continue anymore this thing got me feeling like I can vomit. Anyways, I'm gonna send you guys an activity for you to try to practice this while loop, and you can send me pictures of what you would have done for that activity. Any questions before we close? We can stop at while loop. So we try to be clear on the while loop for today. Alright, if no questions, we shall end here for today. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, sir.
Bye-bye.
And take care of yourself.